My hands were still shaking when I opened that door, because standing on my porch in the South Carolina sun was a face I hadn't seen in 4 years. My brother, Luke, staring at me like he'd seen a ghost. And in a way, he had. Because as far as my family knew, I was gone. Not dead, just gone. The kind of gone you don't come back from. The kind of gone my mother had spent 4 years turning into a story she could live with. But I wasn't gone. I was standing right there, holding my 4-year-old daughter's hand, and I was about to find out that everything I thought I'd escaped was still waiting for me back home. Welcome back to the Family Revenge Tales. My name is Megan Callahan. I'm 35. I'm a nurse educator now, though I spent years before that working nights in the ICU, the kind of job that teaches you what really matters and what doesn't. I live outside Greenville, South Carolina, in a small brick house with a blue front door I painted myself. It's not much, but it's mine. And after everything I survived to get here, mine was the only thing I ever really wanted. To understand why my own brother looked at me like I'd risen from the dead, you have to go back 10 years to the day I graduated college, the first person in my family to do it. My parents cried that day. I remember my mother, Patricia, holding my hand and telling everyone at the reception how proud she was. I believed her. I still believe she meant it in her way, but pride in my family always came with a price tag attached. And I didn't understand that yet. It started small. My parents were behind on the mortgage. Just once, they said, just to get through the month. I sent the money without thinking twice, because that's what a good daughter does, isn't it? Then it was a home equity loan they needed me to co-sign. Then medical bills. Then property taxes. Then my younger brother Luke needed a car, and somehow that became my responsibility too. Then there were expenses at the church. Building funds, mission trips, things my mother insisted mattered to the family's standing in the community. Every single time I tried to pull back, my mother had the same response, delivered in the same soft, wounded voice. "Families don't abandon each other, Megan." So I didn't pull back. I picked up extra shifts. I stopped taking vacations. I watched my savings account stay empty year after year while I told myself I was doing the right thing. I didn't realize, not for the longest time, that my family wasn't just accepting my help anymore. They were building their entire lives around it. I wasn't a daughter who occasionally helped out. I had become the family's financial safety net, and nobody, not once, asked me if I could actually afford it. They just assumed I would say yes. And I always did. The first real crack came when I discovered what that home equity loan, the one with my name on it, had actually been used for. Not the mortgage, not what they told me. My mother had been quietly funding all kinds of things with it, things she'd never discussed with me, while telling relatives that I was, and I quote, blessed enough to take care of the family. I remember sitting at my kitchen table with those loan documents, feeling something shift inside me. It wasn't anger yet. It was just the first flicker of understanding. My mother hadn't built a family that helped each other. She'd built a family that assumed I would pay. And then Ryan happened. I met Ryan Mercer at the hospital. He was a volunteer firefighter, and he also worked construction, supervising crews during the day. The first thing I noticed about him was that he never once asked me what I made. He didn't care about my salary or my benefits or what I could provide. He cared whether I had eaten after a 12-hour shift. He'd leave coffee in my car before I even woke up. He fixed the loose railing on my porch without me asking. He learned, somehow, that my favorite thing about Sundays was sleeping in past 7, and he made sure I got to. For the first time in my adult life, I was with someone who valued me for exactly who I was, not for what I could give him. When Ryan proposed, he didn't do it with some enormous ring. He got down on one knee and handed me an old, worn key. the key to a small fixer-upper we'd talked about renovating together, a house we'd fill with our own life, our own rules. I said yes before he even finished the sentence. I brought him home to meet my parents, so proud, so hopeful. And within minutes, my mother was asking him what he made, whether he had benefits, who would carry the insurance, whether he could really afford the house we were planning. I sat there and watched the color drain slowly out of that moment, and I understood something I'd been avoiding for years. My family didn't want me to build a life. They wanted me to stay available to them. A life of my own was a threat to the arrangement. Not long after that, another emergency came up. There was always another emergency, and my mother demanded I increase my monthly contribution. And for the first time, I said no. She didn't accept it. She reminded me of every sacrifice the family had supposedly made for me, as if my entire childhood had been a loan I was still paying interest on. That was the moment I understood there would never be a final payment. There would always be one more bill, one more emergency, one more reason I was supposed to feel guilty for wanting to keep something for myself. Then, on a Tuesday night that started like any other, Ryan's department got called to a warehouse fire. He went in to help evacuate the workers still trapped inside. The building partially collapsed before he made it out. I don't know how to explain what it feels like to lose someone like that. One moment you're planning a life with someone, and the next you're standing in a hospital hallway while a stranger in uniform tells you he didn't make it. At his funeral, his fellow firefighters stood in full uniform, a wall of blue and silence, honoring a man who ran toward danger to save people he'd never met. I sat there alone. My parents didn't come. Instead, that same week, my mother sent me a text message asking whether I would still be able to make my monthly payment. I read that message maybe a dozen times, waiting for it to say something different. It never did. And in that moment, grieving the man I was supposed to marry, I finally understood something about my own mother that broke my heart more than anything else that year. She didn't know how to love me without needing something from me. A few weeks later, I found out I was pregnant. Ryan's baby. I was overwhelmed, grieving, terrified, and suddenly responsible for a whole other life I'd have to raise alone. I called my mother thinking that surely, this would be the moment she showed up for me the way a mother is supposed to. She didn't ask if I was okay. She didn't ask about Ryan or how I was managing the grief or what I needed. She jumped straight into logistics. I should move back home, the family could help, and then in a quieter voice, she said the sentence that ended everything. With a baby coming, you're going to need us. I heard exactly what she meant. Not we love you, not we'll be there for you. She meant access. Access to my life and eventually access to whatever money I had left. I told her I couldn't keep sending the payments anymore. I told her I was grieving Ryan and pregnant and completely overwhelmed. She exploded. She called me selfish. She said I'd forgotten where I came from, that I was abandoning the very people who'd supported me my whole life. I tried to explain, Ryan is dead, Mom. I'm pregnant. I need you. But she hung up before I finished. I called my father, hoping for something different. He didn't defend me. He just said, quietly, don't make things worse with your mother. That single sentence took whatever hope I had left and put it out like a candle. I stopped calling after that. I stopped sending money, and I left Ohio. I moved to Greenville with almost nothing but a suitcase and a future I couldn't yet picture. I gave birth to my daughter, Ellie, alone in a hospital room, and somehow, through all of it, I rebuilt. I found work, I made a friend, Jenna, who became more family to me than my own ever had. I bought this little brick house, I painted the door blue, I didn't spend my days plotting revenge or posting about what happened, I just lived. I I raised my daughter, I paid my own mortgage with my own money, for the first time feeling like every dollar I earned actually belonged to me. And slowly, quietly, I learned what peace felt like. Meanwhile, back in Ohio, my mother was writing a very different story. She never said I was dead. She never said anything that could be directly disproven. She just said things like, "We don't know where she is anymore, and she's going through something, and we're praying she finds her way home." The church started praying for me. Old photos of me appeared online with birthday captions. Relatives talked about how much my mother missed her daughter. And nobody, not one person, ever called to ask me for my side, because everyone had already decided I was the one who walked away. I did send letters, actually, to my grandmother Evelyn, mostly. Photos of Ellie, updates on how we were doing, nothing more than proof that we were safe and okay. I never expected a response, and for years, I didn't get one. It wasn't until much later that I learned why. My mother had been intercepting information about me for years, quietly keeping the story alive that I wanted nothing to do with the family. I wasn't unreachable. My family simply preferred my absence because it made my mother the victim of a tragedy instead of the cause of one. Then, 4 years after I left, my brother Luke came to South Carolina for work and saw a familiar last name on a delivery address. He recognized me crossing the driveway with Ellie's hand in mine. He knocked on my door, and neither of us said anything for a long moment. Then he looked down at Ellie, and I watched him realize she had Ryan's eyes. "When?" he whispered. I wasn't gone. I was done. I watched something shift in his face, the beginning of him realizing that everything he'd believed for 4 years had been built entirely on our mother's version of events. Within hours of Luke leaving, the family group chat exploded. Suddenly, relatives who hadn't spoken to me in years wanted answers. Some accused me of hiding my own daughter from the family. Others said I should have told everyone about Ryan. A few even accused me of trying to hurt my mother on purpose. And I noticed something painful in all of it. Not one person asked me, "What happened to you?" They only asked, "Why did you do this to us?" My mother didn't waste any time. She announced a special Sunday service at First Grace Church, calling it a family restoration service. Her plan was simple, and I understood it the moment I heard about it. I would come back. She would welcome her lost daughter publicly. I would apologize. The congregation would applaud. And her reputation, the one she'd spent 4 years carefully protecting, would be restored, whole and unblemished in front of everyone who mattered to her. Before that Sunday came, I visited my grandmother, Evelyn. She handed me a box, years of letters and photographs I'd sent that had never reached anyone else. And then she told me something I will never forget as long as I live. "Your mother knew you weren't missing," she said. "She'd seen enough to know you were alive and roughly where, but admitting that would have ruined the story." Then she looked at me with the saddest expression I've ever seen on her face and said, "She didn't need you found, sweetheart. She needed you lost." Around the same time, Luke found our mother's old financial records tucked away in a filing cabinet. Years of documents connected to the money I'd sent. It turned out my contributions hadn't just covered household bills. They'd funded other relatives' debts, church projects, home repairs, Luke's car, personal loans for people I barely knew, and other people's emergencies entirely. Some of the very people who had called me selfish in that group chat had been living in part on my money. I didn't want revenge when I learned that. I just wanted the truth to finally exist somewhere outside my own memory. I had decided I wasn't going to that church service. I wanted to protect Ellie from all of it. But then, one evening, she looked up at me while I was tucking her into bed and asked, "Mommy, do I have a grandma?" That question changed everything. I realized that my silence wasn't protecting her at all. If I stayed quiet, someday she'd hear the same story everyone else had heard, that her mother abandoned her family, disappeared, was selfish and cold. I decided right then that I would not let my daughter grow up inheriting somebody else's lie about who I was. So, I went to First Grace Church that Sunday, with Ellie's hand in mine and my grandmother beside me. The church was packed. My mother stood at the front in a carefully chosen dress, talking about prayer, about forgiveness, about how God had finally brought her daughter home. Then she looked toward the back of the church, saw me, and smiled, like the last 4 years had never happened. "Megan, sweetheart," she said, reaching out her hand, "come up here." I walked forward, but I didn't take the microphone from her. She started telling the congregation her version, that I'd become overwhelmed, isolated myself, refused to come home. I let her get partway through before I spoke, calm and steady. "Can I ask everyone here one question?" The whole church went silent. I looked at my mother and said, "If I disappeared 4 years ago, why did my mother receive every Christmas card I sent?" You could have heard a pin drop in that room. I watched the realization move across people's faces like a wave. I didn't yell. I didn't call her a liar in front of everyone, even though I could have. I just told the truth. All of it, in order. The financial arrangement that started after graduation, the home equity loan, years of payments, meeting Ryan, his death, finding out I was pregnant, my mother's refusal to really hear me, my decision to leave, and the story that had replaced my real one while I was gone. Then I said the sentence that I'd been carrying inside me for 4 years without ever saying it out loud. I didn't disappear. I stopped paying. I let that sit for a moment before I added, being needed is not the same as being loved. My mother lost control of the room for the first time in her life. She accused me of humiliating her in front of everyone she knew. I didn't fight her on it. I just told her, gently, "I'm not here to destroy you. I'm here because my daughter deserves to know the truth about her mother." Some relatives apologized to me right there. Others refused to believe a word of it, and I had to accept that the truth doesn't automatically make people love you. It just means they can't say they didn't know anymore. Luke stood beside me the whole time. He admitted, in front of everyone, that he'd benefited from my money for years, and that he should have asked harder questions long before now. Then he asked me quietly if he could be Ellie's uncle. I told him yes, on one condition. He could be Ellie's uncle, but he could never again be my mother's messenger. He agreed. Before I left the church that day, my mother caught my arm and said, almost pleading, "Everything I did was for this family." And looking at her, I finally understood the sadness underneath those words. She had spent her whole life believing that love meant sacrifice, and somewhere along the way, she'd turned sacrifice into control. I told her, "I believe you thought you were loving us, but being needed is not the same as being loved." Then I took my daughter's hand and I walked out. 6 months have passed since that Sunday. My life isn't perfect, but it's peaceful. And that's more than I ever expected to have again. Luke visits regularly now. Ellie calls him Uncle Luke and lights up every time his truck pulls into the driveway. My grandmother Evelyn comes to Greenville often, and she's become a real part of Ellie's childhood, the way a grandmother should be. My father sent me a short, handwritten card not long ago. It said, "I'm sorry I looked away." I keep it in a drawer. I'm not ready to forgive everything, but I've learned I don't need an apology to keep moving forward with my life. Last week, Ellie and I repainted our front door. She got blue paint on her nose and laughed so hard she could barely hold the brush straight. When we finished, she stood back, looked at the door, and said, "This is our house." And standing there beside her, I realized that was the ending I'd wanted all along. Not revenge, not applause in a crowded church, not even my mother's approval. Just a home where love doesn't come with a bill attached. I didn't disappear 4 years ago. I finally found myself. If this story moved you, if any part of it reminded you of your own family, your own boundaries, or your own blue door somewhere waiting to be painted, then please consider subscribing to the Family Revenge Tales. Every story we tell here is for the people who've had to learn, sometimes the hardest way, that protecting your peace isn't a betrayal. It's survival. Your subscription helps us keep telling stories that remind people they're not alone. And if there's one thing I hope you carry with you after hearing my story, it's this. You don't have to keep earning your place in someone's life. You don't have to pay love with money or silence or obedience or guilt. Real love doesn't send you an invoice. Walk toward the people who see you, not the people who only see what you can give them. And never be afraid to build a life so full and so steady that no one can shake it again. There's real value in a story like this, beyond the drama of it. It shows how financial dependency can quietly disguise itself as family loyalty, and how easy it is to mistake being needed for being loved, until the cost becomes your entire life. It's a story about recognizing manipulation, even when it comes wrapped in the language of faith and family, and about understanding that setting a boundary isn't cruelty, even when someone insists that it is. Most of all, it's a reminder that protecting the next generation sometimes means finally telling the truth, even when silence would be so much easier, because the healthiest thing you can give your children isn't a perfect family story, it's an honest one.